Harold never heard the doctors finish the sentence. The moment they said his 8-year-old grandson might not survive the night, the 74-year-old grandfather tried to rush back into the ICU. But a security guard stepped in front of him. "Sir, you can't go in there." Harold froze. "That's my grandson. I'm sorry. According to the records, you don't have legal guardianship." For a moment, the hallway went completely silent. On the other side of the glass doors, machines beeped around a little boy fighting for his life. On this side stood the only man who had raised him for the last 3 years. Harold's voice trembled. "He calls me Granddad." The guard looked away. Hospital policy didn't. Minutes later, Harold was standing outside in a blizzard, snow collecting on his shoulders as the hospital doors closed behind him. Inside, his grandson lay alone in a hospital bed. Outside, the old man stared up at the 4th-floor window and made a promise. "I ain't leaving you, boy." What happened over the next 22 days would bring a city to tears, force a hospital to change its policies, and prove that sometimes the people who have the least are capable of loving the most. For all the kind hearts watching tonight, share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice truly matters here. And if you enjoy emotional stories with meaning, warmth, and hope, subscribe and become part of our family. The wind off the Patapsco River didn't just blow through Baltimore. It carried the scent of salt, exhaust, and frozen asphalt, cutting straight through the thin wool of Harold Jefferson's jacket. Inside the Enoch Pratt Free Library, the air was warm, smelling of old paper and damp coats. But the security guard had already given them the 10-minute warning. Harold sat on a low plastic chair near the wall outlet, his large, grease-stained hands wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm water. His fingers, permanently darkened by decades of diesel oil and engine grime from his days at the MTA bus depots, were stiff from the cold. Beside him, 8-year-old Malik was curled into a tight ball on the floor, his head resting against Harold's worn work boots. The boy's breathing was too fast, a shallow, ragged whistling that kept Harold's chest tight with fear. "Just a few more minutes." "Corporate," Harold whispered, using the nickname he'd given the boy since he was old enough to carry a briefcase-shaped lunchbox. "They close up. We head down to the shelter on Greenmount." Miss Nina said she saved 2 cots in the back away from the draft. Malik didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on Harold's pant leg. His skin, usually the color of polished walnut, looked gray, coated in a fine sheen of sweat despite the room's chill. When the buzzer sounded, signaling closing time, Harold stood up, his 74-year-old knees popping like dry twigs. He hoisted their life into 2 plastic grocery bags and reached down to pull Malik to his feet. The boy was heavy, dead weight, his limbs loose and incoordinated. "Come on, Malik." Big steps for Granddad. They stepped out into the dark on Cathedral Street. The snow was falling in thick, heavy clumps now, turning the streetlights into blurry halos. The wind hit them like a physical blow. Malik gasped, a sharp, choked sound, and suddenly stopped walking. "Malik?" The boy's eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. His small frame went rigid, his jaw locking with a terrifying click. Before Harold could catch him, Malik's knees buckled. He pitched forward, his face hitting the fresh snow on the pavement. His arms and legs began to violently jerk, striking against the frozen concrete. "No, no, no, Malik!" Harold dropped the bags, scattering their few clothes into the slush. He fell to his knees, his old joints screaming, and pulled Malik into his lap. He turned the boy onto his side, just like he'd seen on the safety posters at the bus garage years ago, trying to keep his airway clear. "Help! Somebody call an ambulance, please." The street was nearly empty. The snow muffled his cries, swallowing them into the Baltimore night. Harold reached into his pockets, but his hands found only lint and a broken pencil. His phone had been shut off 3 months ago when the eviction took the house on North Avenue. "Don't you leave me," Harold sobbed, his tears freezing on his cheeks as he held Malik's shaking shoulders. "You're all I got left. Malik, stay with me." "Boy!" A pair of headlights rounded the corner from Monument Street. A city snowplow slowed down, its yellow strobe light casting long, frantic shadows across the snow. The driver slammed on the brakes, the heavy blade scraping against the asphalt with a deafening screech. The door flung open, and a man shouted into the storm. "Hey, you need help? My boy," Harold screamed back, his voice breaking. "He's having a fit. Call 911. 10 minutes later, the silence of the storm was shattered by the rising wail of sirens. The flashing red and blue lights of the Baltimore City Fire Department ambulance turned the falling snow into a blur of color. 2 paramedics jumped out, their boots crunching loudly on the ice. They shoved Harold aside gently but firmly, dropping a heavy medical bag into the snow. "What's his name? How long has he been seizing?" the female paramedic asked, her fingers already on Malik's neck. Malik Jefferson. He's 8, Harold said, his hands shaking so violently he had to tuck them under his armpits. "It just started 2 minutes before the plow came. He's been sick all week. Just a little fever. I thought it was a cold. We need to move now," the second paramedic said, lifting Malik onto a stretcher. "His oxygen saturation is dropping. We're taking him to Johns Hopkins Children's Center." "I'm coming with him," Harold said, stepping toward the open back doors of the ambulance. The paramedic stopped him, a hand against Harold's chest. "Are you the parent or legal guardian?" "Sir, I'm his grandfather. I raise him," Harold said, his voice rising in panic. "His mother, my daughter, she passed 3 years back. It's just us." "Do you have paperwork? Legal custody documents?" "In the bags." "No. The house was foreclosed. Everything's in storage or lost," Harold stammered, looking back at the plastic bags gathering snow on the sidewalk. "Please, mister. He's never been away from me." The paramedic looked at the child convulsing on the gurney, then back at Harold's desperate, weathered face. "Get in. But you'll need to sort the paperwork out with the hospital social worker as soon as we get there." The doors slammed shut, and the ambulance tore through the snow, its tires spinning against the ice as Harold held onto the metal rail, his eyes locked on his grandson's pale, still face. The pediatric intensive care unit at Johns Hopkins Children's Center was a world of blinding white light and rhythmic, mechanical hums. Harold sat in a vinyl chair in the corner of room 412, looking completely out of place among the high-tech monitors and stainless steel equipment. Malik lay in the center of the bed, a web of wires taped to his chest and a clear plastic tube feeding oxygen into his nose. The diagnosis had come an hour ago from a team of doctors who spoke in a language Harold could barely follow. Acute necrotizing encephalopathy, a rare and severe brain inflammation triggered by a common virus. The door clicked open, and a woman in a sharp gray pantsuit walked in, carrying a thick blue folder. She didn't look like a doctor. She didn't wear scrubs or a stethoscope. Her badge read Elena Vance, Department of Social Services. Behind her stood a tall hospital security guard, his hands resting near his utility belt. "Mr. Jefferson?" she asked, her voice professional, stripped of any warmth. "Yes, ma'am," Harold said, standing up out of habit. "Is there news?" The doctor said they were waiting on another scan. "I'm not here about the medical scans, Mr. Jefferson. I'm here regarding Malik's admissions file," Ms. Vance said, opening her folder. "We've been checking the state registry. We see that Malik's mother, Keisha Jefferson, passed away in 2023. However, there is no record of a legal adoption, formal foster placement, or permanent guardianship filed by you. Is that correct? Harold felt a cold knot form in his stomach, heavier than the Baltimore snow outside. When Keisha passed, I just took him. He was 5. I've been feeding him, clothes on his back, getting him to school 81 every morning. I didn't think I needed a piece of paper from a judge to tell me he's my grandson. The law views it differently, sir, Ms. Vance said, adjusting her glasses. Without formal legal custody, you are considered an unauthorized caregiver. Because Malik is a minor undergoing invasive medical procedures, we cannot legally allow you to make medical decisions, access his charts, or remain in the pediatric unit overnight. You're throwing me out? Harold's voice cracked. He looked at Malik, whose small fingers were twitching in his sleep. He's scared of the dark. Ma'am, if he wakes up and doesn't see me, he's going to think I left him like everybody else did. We are following hospital policy and state law to protect the child, Ms. Vance replied, gesturing to the security guard. Until a legal guardian is established by the state or a court order is issued, Malik is under the temporary protective custody of the hospital. You need to gather your things and leave the floor. Please, Harold begged, stepping toward the bed. Just let me sit in the chair. I won't say a word. I won't touch nothing. The security guard stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Harold's shoulder. Sir, don't make this difficult. We need you to step out now. Harold looked at the guard, then at the social worker, and finally at Malik. His old shoulders slumped. He felt the crushing weight of a system that didn't care about the 30 years he spent fixing city buses, or the taxes he'd paid, or the way he tucked Malik into his coat when the furnace in their apartment failed. To them, he was just an old, homeless man with no credentials. Can I kiss him goodbye? Harold whispered. The social worker hesitated, then gave a brief, tight nod. Harold leaned over the metal bed rail. The copper and oil smell of his skin brushed against Malik's cheek. I'm right outside. Corporate, he whispered into the boy's ear. Granddad ain't leaving you. Not ever. The guard escorted him down the long, bright hallway, through the sliding glass doors, and into the elevator. When the doors opened on the ground floor, the cold air from the main entrance hit Harold immediately. He was pushed out into the lobby, and then out onto the street, into the dark Baltimore night where the storm was still howling. Across the street from the hospital's main pavilion stood a rusted, blue-painted MTA bus shelter. The glass on one side was shattered, letting the snow drift across the metal bench. Harold walked across the slushy street, his boots soaking through, and sat down on the bench. He pulled his old canvas notebook from his pocket, the one he used to keep track of engine part numbers, and a blunt pencil. Through the cracked glass of the shelter, he looked up at the fourth-floor windows of the hospital, where the lights were bright and unreachable. He opened the book to the first blank page and began to write. 3 weeks passed, and the winter storm turned into a permanent, gray Baltimore slush. The bus shelter across from Johns Hopkins became Harold's home, his watchtower, and his church. The nurses on the 4th floor noticed him first every morning at 6 a.m. When the shift changed, the old man would be standing on the sidewalk, looking up at room 412. He didn't shout, he didn't throw rocks, and he didn't try to sneak past the front desk anymore. He just stood there. When the rain came, he pulled a discarded plastic tarp over his head. When the temperature dropped below freezing, he walked in circles around the block to keep his feet from going numb, always keeping his eyes on the 4th-floor glass. The neighborhood started to notice, too. A line cook from the diner down the block began bringing him an insulated container of black coffee and 2 sausage biscuits every morning. A shift supervisor from the MTA garage, a man who remembered Harold from the old days, dropped off a heavy, stained winter coat and a pair of dry socks. "You're going to freeze to death out here, old head," the supervisor had told him. "Come sleep at the Union Hall." "Can't," Harold had replied, his voice raspy from the cold. "If Malik wakes up and looks out that window, he needs to see his granddad. If he don't see me, he'll think I quit on him." Every afternoon, when the sun started to drop behind the row houses of East Baltimore, Harold would stand directly beneath Malik's window. He would open his worn canvas notebook, clear his throat, and read out loud into the wind. He read the stories he used to tell Malik at night, stories about the old streetcars that used to run down Baltimore Street, about the ghosts that supposedly lived in the basement of the old Memorial Stadium, and about the time his mother caught a blue crab bigger than her dinner plate down at Fort McHenry. A young pediatric nurse named Sarah took a video of it one evening from the window of an empty patient room. In the video, Harold's voice was faint but steady against the city traffic, his old hand holding the notebook open while snow accumulated on his shoulders. She posted it online with a short caption. "This grandfather is forced to sleep in a bus shelter because he doesn't have the proper paperwork to visit his dying grandson. Love shouldn't require a permit." Within 48 hours, the video had been shared 10,000 times across Baltimore and beyond. Local news vans started parking near the bus shelter, their satellite dishes pointing at the sky. Public sympathy was growing, but inside the hospital's administrative offices, the position remained unchanged. A formal statement was issued. Johns Hopkins Children's Center complies strictly with state health regulations and child safety protocols regarding non-custodial individuals. Inside room 412, Malik's condition was deteriorating. The inflammation in his brain had stabilized, but the boy had withdrawn into a profound, terrifying silence. He refused to speak to the nurses. He spat out his medicine, and his nutritional intake had dropped to dangerous levels. He lay under the white sheets like a ghost, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, completely unresponsive to the bright toys or children's books the staff brought in. Dr. Andre Whitfield, the chief pediatric specialist handling Malik's case, stood at the foot of the bed, reviewing the chart. The boy's vitals were slipping, not from the virus anymore, but from a total lack of will. "He's giving up, Andre," Nurse Sarah said softly from the doorway. "He hasn't eaten anything but 2 spoonfuls of gelatin in 3 days. He won't look at us." Dr. Whitfield sighed, rubbing his temples. He was 46, a man who had climbed to the top of his field through sheer discipline. But his roots were in the same East Baltimore streets outside. He walked over to the window and looked down. Through the glass, he saw the old man sitting in the bus shelter, his head bowed over his notebook, writing by the light of a street lamp. "That's still him out there?" Dr. Whitfield asked. 22 days now," Sarah said. "The police tried to move him for vagrancy twice, but the community members stood around him until the cops left." Dr. Whitfield: "That man is the only family this baby has." Andre didn't say anything, but his mind flashed back 30 years, to an old row house on Chester Street, and to his own grandfather, a steelworker who had worked double shifts at Sparrows Point with bleeding hands just so Andre could buy his first medical textbook. He knew the look of that old man down there. It wasn't the look of an intruder. It was the look of a man who had anchored his entire soul to a child's heartbeat. The next morning, Dr. Andre Whitfield did something that broke every administrative protocol in the Johns Hopkins employee handbook. He walked out the front doors of the hospital, crossed the street in his white lab coat, and stepped into the rusted blue bus shelter. Harold looked up, his eyes bloodshot and surrounded by deep, dark circles of exhaustion. He instinctively pulled his canvas notebook against his chest, as if the doctor had come to take that away from him. 2. Mr. Jefferson, Andre said, extending his hand. I'm Dr. Whitfield. I'm the specialist overseeing Malik's care. Harold hesitated, then shook the doctor's hand with his rough, calloused fingers. Is my boy gone? No, Andre said quickly, sitting down on the cold metal bench beside him. He's not gone, but he's fighting a battle he's losing. And it's not because of the medicine. He's lonely, Mr. Jefferson. He's shutting down. Harold looked away, his jaw tightening as he stared at the hospital walls. I tried to tell them women inside that. They wouldn't listen. They look at me and see nothing but an old man who can't pay his rent. I saw the video of you reading through the window, Andre said softly. What's in the book? Harold looked down at the frayed edges of the notebook. He opened it to a page in the middle, his handwriting large, shaky, but clear. Just things I want him to remember. I wrote down the recipe for his mama's potato salad. The one with too much mustard. Just how he likes it. I wrote down the names of his uncles who died before he was born. I wrote down a promise that we're going to get that red bicycle he saw in the window on Eastern Avenue. He closed the book with a heavy thud. Just things to let him know there's a home waiting for him. Even if it ain't got a roof right now. Andre sat in silence for a long moment, the wind whistling through the broken glass of the shelter. He thought about the hospital board, the legal liabilities, and the risk to his own career. Then he thought about his grandfather's heavy steel-toed boots sitting by the front door after a 16-hour shift. Come with me, Dr. Whitfield said, standing up. They won't let me past the desk. Doctor, Harold said. They won't stop you if you're with me, Andre replied. We're going to do a clinical intervention. That's what I'm writing in the chart. 10 minutes later, Harold was standing inside room 412. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Malik was lying on his side, his face turned toward the bare wall, his small shoulders hunched. Harold walked to the side of the bed, his boots making a heavy, scraping sound on the linoleum. He didn't look at the monitors or the tubes. He just reached out and placed his large, dark hand on Malik's head, his fingers gently moving through the boy's tangled hair. Hey, corporate, Harold said, his voice deep and rumbling in the quiet room. Granddad's here. I had to finish fixing that bus. But I'm here now. For 3 seconds. Nothing happened. Then Malik's shoulders went rigid. The boy turned his head slowly, his wide, dark eyes blinking against the light as if he were seeing a ghost. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, 2 massive tears rolled down his cheeks, soaking into the white hospital pillowcase. Granddad? The boy whispered, his voice small and cracked. Yeah, baby, Harold said, his own voice breaking as he leaned over the bed rail and pulled the boy against his chest. I'm here. I ain't never left you. I was right across the street the whole time. Nurse Sarah, standing by the door, wiped her eyes. Dr. Whitfield looked at the monitor above the bed. For the first time in 3 weeks, Malik's oxygen saturation percentage began to creep upward, and the erratic spike in his heart rate smoothed out into a steady, healthy rhythm. It wasn't a miracle. It was medicine that couldn't be prescribed in a syringe. The battle, however, was far from over. Within 6 hours of Harold's visit, the hospital's legal department caught wind of Dr. Whitfield's clinical intervention, and threatened to suspend his privileges. But before they could draft the paperwork, Attorney Vanessa Brooks walked through the main clinic doors, flanked by 2 television news crews and 3 members of the Baltimore City Council. Vanessa was 39, a product of the public housing developments in West Baltimore, and she had built her reputation by turning institutional legal battles into public crusades. She had seen the video of Harold in the bus shelter and had spent the last 48 hours gathering every scrap of paper that proved Harold Jefferson was a father in every sense but the text on a birth certificate. Because of the high profile of the case, a family court judge agreed to hold an emergency guardianship hearing directly inside the hospital's third-floor conference room. Avoiding the delay of a standard court date, the room was crowded with administrators, lawyers for the state, and hospital security. Harold sat at the end of a long mahogany table, wearing a borrowed suit that was too large for his frame, his canvas notebook resting on the table before him like a shield. Your Honor, the attorney representing the Department of Social Services argued, standing before the judge's makeshift bench. Never missed a parent-teacher conference, even when he had to walk 3 miles in the rain because his bus pass had expired. She reached across the table and picked up Harold's canvas notebook, holding it up for the judge to see. And finally, Your Honor, we have this. 30 pages of letters, oral history, and love written from a freezing bus shelter while this city's institutions told this grandfather he didn't exist. The state says he has no home for Malik. I say Harold Jefferson is Malik's home. The system failed this family by taking their housing, but we cannot allow it to take their humanity. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had spent 20 years in the Baltimore court system, looked at the notebook, then down at the school records, and finally at Harold. Mr. Jefferson, the judge said, do you have anything you want to say? The state does not question Mr. Jefferson's affection for the child, but the facts remain. He is currently unhoused, living in a public transit shelter, and has no legal standing or verifiable income to support a dependent child with severe medical needs. The state must place Malik in a licensed foster care facility upon his discharge. Vanessa Brooks stood up, her voice cutting through the room like a bell. The state talks about facts, Your Honor, but they are ignoring the evidence of a life lived. If the court looks at the exhibit packet I provided, you will find records from Baltimore City Public School 81. Every single report card for the last 3 years was signed by Harold Jefferson. You will find immunization records signed by Harold Jefferson. You will find a statement from Malik's third-grade teacher, testifying that Mr. Jefferson. Harold stood up slowly, his hands resting on the table to steady his shaking frame. He didn't look at the lawyers or the cameras. He just looked at the judge. I don't know much about the law, Your Honor. I spent my life under the chassis of city buses, making sure people could get where they were going. But I know my daughter trusted me with her boy. When she was dying, she took my hand and said, take care of my baby. Daddy, I gave my word. A man's word is all he's got at the end of the day. If you take him away from me, you might as well put me under the dirt right now, because I ain't got nothing else to live for. The room was completely silent for nearly a minute. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. The judge brought her gavel down with a sharp, decisive crack that echoed off the glass walls. Immediate temporary guardianship is granted to Harold Jefferson, with permanent status pending a home study by an independent agency. Furthermore, this court orders the hospital to permit Mr. Jefferson full, unrestricted visitation rights effective immediately. 6 months later, the gray winter had given way to a hot, humid Baltimore summer. The Johns Hopkins Children's Center had changed, too. Following the public outcry from the case, Dr. Whitfield and Vanessa Brooks had successfully pushed the board to launch the Jefferson Family Connection Initiative, a program that provided legal aid and emergency housing navigation to families facing institutional barriers during medical crises. On a quiet, tree-lined street in East Baltimore, Malik walked out of the Community Rehabilitation Center, his leg braces clicking against the pavement, but his stride steady. He was holding Harold's hand. Through the assistance of a community housing program funded by the new initiative, they had moved into a small, red brick townhouse with a small front porch. Harold sat down on the top step of the porch, the summer sun warming his old bones. Malik sat right beside him, leaning his head against Harold's shoulder, a cold cup of juice in his hand. Harold pulled the old canvas notebook from his pocket. The cover was faded and stained with water, but the pages were intact. He opened it to the very last page, where he had written a new entry that morning. "All right, corporate," Harold said, smiling as he tapped the page with his blunt pencil. "Let's read the part about the red bicycle again. Because the man from the store said it's coming on Monday." Malik laughed, a bright, clear sound that carried across the pavement, proving that love, not paperwork, was what kept them both alive.